In-season development. One of the most important but also most difficult parts of being a competitive Formula 1 team. Just because you start the season at the top doesn't mean you'll stay there. It's a race within the racing, where one good update can completely change your season for the better or for the worse. Let's take a look at which teams are catching Red Bull, which teams are falling off, and which teams really need to go back to the drawing board if they're going to save their season. Red Bull are still just about the benchmark of the Formula 1 grid. The chaos behind the scenes, which seems to be ongoing, hasn't stopped them from going into the break leading both championships. In general, despite the team not breaking the sheer amount of records they did last year for their absolute dominance, they have still won the majority of races, with Max winning 7 of the 14 races so far this season. However, I'm not sure that we can say they're the out-and-out fastest car every race weekend anymore. They started the season comfortably ahead of the field in Bahrain through the first 5 Grand Prix, but since Miami, we've seen 6 different race winners other than Max Verstappen from 3 different constructors joining Red Bull celebrating a Formula 1 victory. So I wanted to take a look at who have been the biggest winners and biggest losers in terms of their average relative pace development compared to Red Bull's progression so far this season, based on data reported by Formula 1's own analysis team, putting them in order from the team who's developed their car the best all the way through to the team that's developed their car the worst when compared to Red Bull's progression. There are a few more obvious teams towards the top end of this list which will keep Red Bull on their toes, a real shock team in the middle, and also some devastating losses for some teams you wouldn't expect towards the bottom, which could have a huge impact on the second half of this year and 2025. So let's start with the most obvious team that's gained the most on Red Bull this season, which is McLaren. The big upgrade package in Miami took them from knocking on the door of Formula 1 wins every now and then to winning multiple races in a season for the first time since 2012, and bringing them into contention for the Constructors' Championship, which they haven't won this millennium. Their development has gained them a massive 0.28 seconds on Red Bull's pace since the start of the season. They're not yet ahead of Red Bull on average over the 14 races, because that takes into account the first 5, but narrow it down to the last 3 or 4, and they're definitely the quickest car out on track. Although one thing I thought was quite interesting when looking into all of this is even McLaren aren't 100% sure how they've managed such a huge gain. That's right, McLaren was surprised by its own speed post-Miami, and more specifically was surprised to see how much more confident the drivers have been inside the car. The McLaren DNA of a car that's difficult to drive has always been part of why drivers like Daniel Ricciardo struggled to adapt, and even before that, Carlos Sainz didn't really enjoy driving the car. It was a mystery that nobody could really put their finger on, like why was this car so awkward to drive, but maybe through luck more than actually understanding, they seem to have gotten rid of a few of those difficult characteristics, so the drivers now in Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri can really access the speed of this McLaren package. Since the upgrade in Miami, the team have focused on really understanding why this car is the best it's been in over a decade, and understanding those setup changes for individual tracks, which will put them in an incredibly competitive window for the second half of the season, if they can get the strategy right. I feel like saying Alpine are the second most improved team on the grid this season, whilst true, is also quite hollow praise. When you look at just how bad they started off this year, things couldn't have really gotten worse from that point. However, they have managed to gain 0.26 seconds compared to Red Bull this year so far, and the game changer for Alpine when comparing Bahrain to Spa is that they've been able to reduce the weight of their car dramatically. Their car started the year massively overweight after failing a preseason crash test on Esteban Ocon's car, which meant the team had to bulk up certain areas of the bodywork and just make the Alpine car much fatter than they wanted it to be. But as the year has progressed, they have taken a lot of that weight off the car, first of all in China and then again in Canada. And although they have brought some aerodynamic upgrades too, the main steps forwards that they've been able to take have just been taking weight off of that car. In fact, after Gasly went on a great run of scoring points in 4 races in a row from Monaco through to Austria after the second round of huge weight-saving upgrades, it looked like they might have fully turned around their season and would be really competing in the midfield. Then in classic Alpine fashion, they backed that up with minimal aerodynamic progress and mechanical issues in Silverstone, Hungary, and Spa. So there have been some ups and downs. Looking at the positives, in terms of outright pace, they have been able to gain on Red Bull and overtake Williams and Sauber to now be Formula 1's 8th fastest car. Looking at the negatives, they're still way off catching the likes of Aston Martin, RB, and Haas ahead of them in the second half of the season. And as always at Alpine, the team structure is completely changing once again, with Famine leaving during the summer break, Oliver Oakes coming in, anything could happen. Mercedes have broken the norm when it comes to Formula 1 this season. We often see teams bring a huge upgrade package to a specific race weekend and then shuffle that around to try and find the best setup. Mercedes haven't done that and instead have brought little upgrades to almost every race weekend, and that's allowed them to iterate over and over again on their car. These small building blocks that they can easily adapt and work off of have slowly brought their car forwards towards the Red Bulls, gaining 0.5 seconds in comparison to their Constructors' Championship successors. It's all been about being able to balance their aero deficiencies from the start of the year and mechanically improve their car's underlying performance without dramatic changes, so that the drivers actually feel more comfortable behind the wheel and can showcase their talents. We always talk about George and Lewis being the strongest driver lineup on the grid, and they've finally been able to flourish in the last few race weekends, with George and Lewis picking up incredible race wins, 3 of the last 4 victories going to Mercedes, and of course nearly picking up a 1-2 in Belgium outside of a disqualification. The reason I highlight the mechanical changes is because it's something that we as the public hear a lot less about. When a team makes an aero change, they have to announce it to the FIA. But when they make mechanical changes to the suspension or the chassis, they don't have to declare it, and we don't really get to hear about it. We have, though, seen this bump appear on the nose of the Mercedes car in recent race weekends, which is just about in line with where the suspension meets the cockpit. So the talk is that Mercedes have elongated their suspension and found some fancy way of increasing performance, which is hiding underneath that bump. Of course, we as the public will never really know, because if they have found something special, they're not sharing it with us, let alone sharing it with the rest of the grid. But the overall package that Mercedes now has seems to be more harmonious, and they seem to finally have a grasp on this rule set as we go into the crucial phase of building up into 2025, where I think they could really be in the fight for the Constructors' Championship. The first team on this list to have lost ground to Red Bull in terms of development is Haas, but I've been really impressed with them so far this season, because although they haven't made up any ground to Red Bull, they have been able to pretty much keep pace with the development of Formula 1's championship leading team, only losing 0.02 seconds to Red Bull so far this year. That is something I never thought I would say about Haas. They've managed to bring one major upgrade package to their car. It happened before the summer break, which is almost unheard of when it comes to Haas in recent years. And most importantly, that upgrade didn't make them slower. They started the season as the 7th fastest car, and they've cemented themselves as the 7th fastest package. And they've even been able to show that in the standings too. And I know that you could argue that staying the same distance from Red Bull at the start of the season compared to now doesn't really help you in the long run. And you're right, you can't match Red Bull in terms of development and start winning races. But when you consider the only teams who have gained on Red Bull this year in terms of development are McLaren, Alpine and Mercedes, Haas can take a huge amount of positives from the start of this season, especially because they're under new management. Moving on from Haas to their closest competitors in RB, and there isn't too much to talk about here. They started the season as the 6th fastest car, and they've remained the 6th fastest car, overall falling away from Red Bull by just over a tenth. And they have brought upgrades to the car, which have kept them on pace with the other teams in and around them, even though those upgrades haven't been dramatically successful. The negative is that the Haas car is actually getting closer in terms of pace, but RB still have the edge on average, and more importantly, still have the edge in the Constructors' Championship too. Whilst the positive that RB has run into this season is that the little progress they have made has allowed them to close in on the team just above them in Aston Martin, who are further down on this list, and let's just say the door might open for RB to jump into being the 5th fastest car on the grid due to the failings of their rival, but we'll get into them later. Now moving on to Sauber, and possibly the only list that they're not bottom of this season, because relative to Red Bull, they haven't fallen away as much as others on the grid, only losing 0.12 seconds on average across the opening 14 races, but that doesn't mean they're anything other than the slowest team on the grid by a huge margin, and of course, the only team not to score any points so far this year. They are trying. We have seen some big upgrade packages to the car, most recently in Hungary when they changed almost every aerodynamic surface on the car, from the wings to the floor to the side pods, but it doesn't feel like they've made up any ground on the other cars at the back of the pack. It just feels like this team is in limbo. With the team becoming Audi in 2026, all the people that are being hired and brought in seem to go straight into that project instead of focusing on the here and now. I think that means until it becomes Audi in a year and a half's time, we won't actually see them anywhere other than 10th in the Constructors and running around towards the back end of the grid, just hoping that others gift them points along the way. Williams have fallen away from the frontrunners as the season has progressed, and it's not through lack of development in my opinion, but possibly through the sheer exhaustion of the team back at the factory. Looking at the numbers, Williams on average have lost 0.18 seconds to Red Bull since the start of the year's pace in Bahrain, with Alex Albon, who's managed 2 9th place finishes, being their only points on the board so far. However, I think this fall-off had to be expected after how the season started. First, Bowles explained that over the winter, the team not only completely changed their design philosophy around the car, but also hundreds of the manufacturing processes used by the Williams team, which meant the car was only just about ready for Bahrain thanks to some heroics back at the factory. And then Alex and Logan thanked the team by having a huge crash in Australia and Japan at literally the worst point in the season possible. Having Bahrain, Saudi, Australia, Japan and China together meant the teams didn't have to go back to Europe between each of those races, which is exactly what Williams had to do, sending the chassis from Australia back to the UK, to Japan, back to the UK, to China. It's not only the least cost-effective thing that you can do at that part of the season, but also stretched an already exhausted factory team to their limits, with many having to work overtime and even sleep at the factory to ensure that the cars were ready to race. So the Williams team couldn't focus on developing the car when they were already putting all of their time and effort into just fixing the one that they had. Of all the teams on the Formula One grid, they're probably the one team that is in need of a proper summer break. Ferrari took the opposite approach to Mercedes and have gone the opposite way to Mercedes. Whereas Mercedes, as I said before, moved forwards with small upgrades every weekend, Ferrari brought a massive upgrade package to Imola, which made changes to the floor, the body, the wings, their entire aerodynamic package really. It was almost like a Ferrari SF24 2.0. The problem though is that all of those upgrades made the car worse and have now placed them behind Mercedes in the running order most weekends. Well, actually, that's not entirely true. The car itself isn't technically worse. It is faster when the drivers are able to put together a clean lap. It's just almost impossible to put together a clean lap with how difficult this new package is to drive. Meaning relative to Red Bull, they've lost almost a quarter of a second from where they were at the beginning of the season. This has meant taking all of those new upgrades off of the car after Imola and starting to slowly put them back on piece by piece rather than all in one go to see where the drivability problems of the car actually lie. And in Formula One, when you take a step back in development, you usually lose out to the rest, and Ferrari have lost out massively to McLaren and Mercedes in terms of general race pace and in terms of points scored since Imola. It's not all doom and gloom, it's not like they're completely out of the running, and if they can get to the bottom of their problems, they probably can catch the other teams in the top 4 fairly quickly, but it's disappointing to have another season where Ferrari started the year as the closest competitor to Red Bull, and Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz were constantly in contention for podiums, only to now be clearly the 4th fastest team and happy with 5th and 6th place finishes. For Aston Martin, it's actually been an identical story to last year, just from a different starting point. In 2023, they started as the 2nd fastest car on the grid, and by this point in the season had dropped to maybe 4th or 5th fastest. This year, they started from 4th fastest, ahead of Mercedes, but have now dropped back to 5th fastest, or arguably could be 6th fastest behind RB pretty soon. And that's because they've taken the biggest step backwards from Red Bull when compared to every other team on the grid, with their fall off this year being equivalent to almost half a second on average, meaning that they're the worst team in terms of development by a considerable margin, well, by more than double anybody else. You just cannot be losing that kind of lap time, let alone 2 seasons in a row. They look a world away from the Aston team that got Fernando Alonso 8 podiums last season, and if they lose that kind of lap time again next year, they could end this regulation cycle as the slowest team on the grid. They could actually lose out to stake Sauber. And it's so strange because they started the season comfortably the 4th or 5th fastest team most weekends. Fernando Alonso was easily getting into the points for the first 6 Grand Prix weekends. And the most worrying thing once again is Imola, where they brought their upgrade. It felt more like a downgrade, especially when even Fernando Alonso wasn't able to get any performance from the car, so he was giving up on trying to be competitive in search of answers. I mean, outside of a 6th place in Canada, it's pretty tough reading for Alonso post-Imola. Thankfully, the upgrade that they rushed onto the car in Silverstone seemed to be a lot better and correct some of the errors from earlier in the season, but Aston Martin's in-season development always seems to be on a knife edge. Their upgrades either work okay or completely destroy the performance of the car, which means on average through the season, their development is the worst on the entire grid. I guess Aston Martin can count themselves a little bit lucky that they've been out of the headlines, mainly thanks to Sergio Perez. Even though Red Bull are keeping him after the summer break, I think it is an absolutely terrible idea for Red Bull to have done so, and it'll affect their future. And I talk about that in this video here. So click that link and I'll see you over there.